Hi everyone. Chapter 27 re-emphasizes some of the materials we learned from the urinary system chapter and the respiratory system chapter. So that's why I said in the urinary system chapter, some of the concept was not going to be the last time you see them. Osmosis will be another critical concept for this chapter, so be sure you're very clear on the concept of hypertonic and hypotonic solutions and how cells react. All right, so let's get started. In our body, we can separate fluids into two different categories: extracellular fluid, abbreviated as ECF, and intracellular fluid, abbreviated as ICF. ECF is the total volume of fluid that is outside of cells, which is your interstitial fluid. That's around your cells, and also fluid that's in your blood, which is plasma, that's circulating around your body all the time. Okay, so 99% of the ECF is made up of water. Okay, we already mentioned about plasma and interstitial fluid in previous chapter when we were talking about blood. Okay, now ICF is the total volume of fluid that's inside your cell, which is pretty much all that fluid combined together from each cell's cytosol. Okay, so inside the cytoplasm of the cell surrounding your within the inside of the cell, that's your ICF, and it is a total volume of all the cells in your body inside every one of your cell as total that makes up your volume of ICF. It's not just one cell cytosol content, but all the cells cytosol content. Now, both fluid volume and electrolyte composition of ECF and ICF must maintain homeostasis. Okay, whether it be ionic concentrations or pH must be maintained in a very tight, narrow parameters. Okay, so range, okay, very tight range. So the three main topics, okay, we will discuss in this chapter is how our body is able to do fluid balance and make sure that the water gained by our digestive system is always equal to the water lost by the urinary system. If it's imbalanced in any way, for example, if it's too much water gained, we can end up with hyperhydration, which we'll talk about. And if there is too much water lost, then we'll end up with dehydration, and I will talk about those. Electrolyte balance also needs to be tightly regulated. This includes all those ions when you ingest those compounds, okay, because they will dissociate into their individual ions as you eat that food or drink, okay, using the reabsorption that's happening inside your small intestine. And also there will be ions that will be lost in your urine, sweat, and feces, okay. And this is why they say that if a person was to have rounds and rounds of diarrhea, you're losing a lot of electrolytes, okay, and you have to replenish your body of electrolytes. Or if you go out and run for hours and hours and hours without replenishing your body of electrolytes, you will feel very bad, because electrolytes will be lost in urine and feces as well, okay, yeah, and sweat as well, okay. And the last part we'll talk about in this chapter is the balance of acid and base. The amount of hydrogen ions produced must equal the hydrogen ions lost. This is what's going to keep our body fluids pH stabilized. And remember, this has to be kept at a very tight range from a pH of 7.35 and to pH of 7.45. So it must be kept within this narrow range of pH levels, okay? Now, our body can also generate hydrogen ions during metabolism, as we have learned in the previous chapter about metabolism. Okay, now how we get rid of those hydrogen ions is mainly through the kidneys, which we can release hydrogen ions into the urine through your DCT or the collecting system, or we have buffer system in the body that helps us regulate our pH and make sure that our hydrogen ions does not get too high or too low. Lungs also participate in a bit of that buffering capacity by excreting CO2. Okay, and we'll talk about all those different type of acid-base buffer system we have in the body. All right. So, collectively, as a whole, the ICF contain more water than your ECF, okay? As you can see in this bar graph here, this is your ICF, this is your ECF, okay? ECF is the sum of all these different fluid in the body and the water content, okay? And this is the water content of ICF, and you can see that there is this much more of water content in the ICF than ECF. There's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a bit, okay? And I already went through what are the components, what makes up your ECF and ICF. And don't forget that part of your ECF, other than those in your blood, remember cerebrospinal fluid is part of your ECF. Synovial and serous fluid that we talked about within your joints and between your serous membrane is also considered part of your ECF. Now, in terms of electrolyte components, the main ions in the ECF are sodium ions, okay, whether it be from the plasma or interstitial fluid, they are both considered as part of your ECF. Chloride ions is another big component, and bicarbonate ions, okay? The main ions in your ICF are potassium ions, magnesium ion, phosphate, and negatively charged proteins. Okay, remember we talked about from previous chapter about membrane potential. Why we have a negative membrane potential is because we have a lot of these negative charged proteins inside our cytoplasm to make that difference in membrane potentials. And hence, the osmotic concentration of a solution depends on the solute concentration. Okay, whenever I talk about osmotic concentration, remember to think of it as how much stuff or solutes you have in solution. Okay, so higher osmotic concentration always means higher solute concentration, okay? These brackets means concentration if you remember from your chemistry class, okay? All right. So that is why even though ECF and ICF is supposed to have equal osmotic concentration, they have to be equal. They have to be at equilibrium, okay? They're at equilibrium, but yet you see a more water content in the ICF because in this graph here, it tells you that you have a lot more salt or solute content, okay? This much more than your ECF, and that's why your water content must be higher in the ICF to balance out the osmotic concentration between the two types of fluid that's in your body, okay? So any minor differences in solute concentration will be and can easily be eliminated by the process of osmosis. It's the quickest way to balance your osmotic concentration because all plasma membranes of every single cell is permeable to water. You don't require any extra transport pumps to get water across. So that's the easiest way and quickest way your body to balance those osmotic concentrations. Now, from what you learn about the plasma membrane in Bio 1406, remember that plasma membrane is considered to be selectively permeable to solutes because it only allows certain things through. Only small molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, or even lipid-soluble molecules like vitamin A and K can move freely through the plasma membrane without the assistance of any proteins. Other molecules like ions, for example, or polar molecules, charged stuff, large bulky molecules like proteins, amino acids, or glucose, those will require the assistance of transport proteins within the plasma membrane, okay? So ions and those other bulky stuff I was talking about can either pass through diffusion or carrier-mediated transport. So diffusion is where we have ion channels, okay, within the plasma membrane, or some carrier protein like gated ion channel where it changes shape to pop out ions or pop in ions, kind of like how sodium potassium pump works, okay? And hence because of the selectively permeable membrane and these proteins that are highly regulated, we can maintain an internal cellular environment that is different from the surrounding environment outside of the cell. Okay. And hence, the concept of fluid and electrolyte balance is where clinical application will focus on rapid fluid and solid movements that goes with your blood, plasma, and saline transfusion to counteract the blood loss or dehydration. Remember, one of those case studies you did previously was about how a patient is losing blood profusely, and then on the way to the hospital, on the ambulance, the EMTs gave her saline solution, okay, because we don't know her blood type at the moment, but yet her blood pressure and blood volume is dropping profusely. So in order to counteract that, you gave them saline solution to increase the blood volume and, in a sense, increase the blood pressure temporarily anyway. And by the time she gets to the hospital, she gets a blood type going, then she can have the proper red blood cells replenish as well. Okay. So that's what a lot of clinical application focuses on when we think about the fluid and electrolyte balance, is what kind of solution you're going to give to the patient in what type of situation. Okay. Now, there are 4 basic principles for fluid and electrolyte balance we have to keep in mind when we think about all these different processes in our body. One is that all homeostatic mechanisms that monitor or adjust composition of the body fluids respond to changes in the ECF, not the ICF. Okay, and this makes sense logically speaking, because it is easier to monitor your entire body system's fluid at one time as circulating fluids, interstitial fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and plasma fluid. Okay, whereas it is hard to monitor every single little cell in your body and make sure that every little single cell has their enough fluid content, enough salt content. Okay, so if you monitor what happens in the ECF, then that the same thing is going to happen to ICF, because ECF circulates around the body, and whatever osmotic concentration is affected in the ECF, it will then help with the ICF as well, okay, and also affect the ICF. So that's why whatever we do, it makes more sense for it to be applied to the ECF as a system as a whole versus every little single cell in your body, okay? So there are receptors in your capillaries and blood vessels, okay, that will monitor plasma or cerebrospinal fluid content, okay, that would trigger the appropriate nervous or endocrine responses depending if you have too much osmotic concentration or too low osmotic concentration. It will adjust accordingly with hormones, and we'll revisit those hormones in a bit. Second point is that there are no receptors that directly monitor fluid and electrolyte balance. Okay, there's no cells in your body that measures the exact amount of sodium ions in your body or the exact amount of calcium ions in your body in milligrams per liter. Okay, that is something we can do with blood tests, but in your body naturally there is nothing to monitor that. So the only thing that can be monitored in your body is plasma volume and osmotic concentration. That's what we're relying in your body to make sure that there is a balance of fluid and electrolytes. So that's why osmosis is a critical point when we think about fluid and electrolyte balance. Third point is cells cannot move water by active transport, okay? Even though when we talked about the insertion of aquaporins within the collecting duct and DCT of the nephron, those are not water pumps. They are just water channels that allow water to flow through according to their osmotic concentration, okay? It is not pumping water from one place to another, okay? There's no that driving force or protein possible to pump water. So everything happens passively via osmosis, and hence we always go by the rule, water will always follow salt, okay? If there's higher salt content, then add more water to that side to dilute it out. If there's less salt content, remove the water to concentrate that salt in, okay? All right, and lastly, your body's water and electrolyte content will increase if dietary gains exceeds the loss to the environment. Okay, just like how we talked about in metabolism, the more fat, amino acids, and sugar that you put into your body, then it's going to be, stored in your body in some way. Okay. If you're exceeding the amount that you need, or when we talked about the vitamin example in urinary system, if your flood and exceeds the amount of vitamins that your body needs, you saturate all your renal threshold for that particular vitamin, then it's just going to be peed out into your urine because you're not using them. So if whatever you eat in excess, keep in mind that, somehow your body either have to have a way of storing it or have to have a way of excreting it out of your body, okay? All right, so hence we will re-emphasize those hormones we talked about in the last chapter for the urinary system as primary hormones that regulate fluid and electrolyte balance for the body, okay? We talked about ADH, which is a type of antidiuretic hormone that promotes water retention by your kidneys. Okay, remember that it is your hypothalamus that generates ADH hormone, and that gets sent to your pituitary gland. Remember, your neural hypophysis or neuroposterior portion of your pituitary gland doesn't make any hormones, but it relays hormones from the hypothalamus to the rest of your body, and one of those was ADH. Okay, so special cells in the hypothalamus are called osmoreceptors, which monitor the osmotic concentration of your ECF. If osmotic concentration was to go up, increase, then that means there's too much solutes in the body, so we need to dilute that out, and your hypothalamus then will trigger the release of ADH and sort of distribute it through the body via your neural hypophysis. Okay, and remember, those hormones will travel through axons because those hormones within the hypothalamus are made in the neurons, and they will get towards your fenestrated capillaries within your pituitary gland. So higher osmotic concentration, more ADH will be released. Okay. So the two main effects of ADH are, one, it will stimulate water reabsorption in your kidneys, as we have talked about, and that's why you will end up concentrating urine. Remember, in the urinary chapter, we said if you have ADH release, you will make small volume of concentrated urine because your body's reabsorbing a lot of that water content. Second, it will stimulate hypothalamic thirst center for you because your body needs water. Other than reabsorbing water, what about go drink some more water? Okay, so that will give you the need to want to become thirsty, and you will look for water to drink. Okay. And this is a very good diagram that talks about what is stimulated when you have either a decreased volume of your ECF or increased osmolarity of your ECF, okay? So when your ECF volume decreases, that increases basically is increasing the solute concentration in the body. So that will stimulate your osmoreceptors in the hypothalamic thirst center to tell you that you are thirsty and you will drink water. And once water is reabsorbed through your gastrointestinal tract, whether through your small intestines or your large intestine, that will decrease that osmolarity of your ECF back, increase volume of your ECF back. Then once it's back to homeostasis, it's going to inhibit your osmoreceptors and tell it, hey, we have enough water, you can stop stimulating that thirst center now because now we're replenished with water. Okay, same thing as if you happen to eat a lot of salt, through food or something. That is, kind of like, imagine if you you're eating a bag of chips while you're watching a movie, and that's why they always give you sodas as well and sell you sodas, because when you eat a lot of chips, all that salt concentration will actually decrease your your saliva secretion and give you dry mouth because of increased osmotic concentration. You have a lot of salt content, which then tells your body you need to reabsorb more water to dilute out that sodium concentration. So that's why you have dry mouth, which then stimulates the same thing of you wanting to go and drink something to replenish your osmolarity and your volume of ECF, okay? All right, so the second primary hormone we mentioned in the last chapter was aldosterone, which is a corticosteroid hormone that stimulates sodium reabsorption by your kidneys. And we have already discussed the effects of having aldosterone around. We talked about how the more aldosterone you have, the more conservation of sodium ions you have. And because sodium ions is highly related to all those other ions we talked about in the urinary system, when you have more conservation of sodium, you will also increase water retention because water always follows salt. Second thing, you will increase chloride reabsorption as well, chloride ion, because sodium and chloride participate in co-transport, as we can see here and have already discussed in the urinary system. Okay, so the more sodium ions reabsorbing, the more chloride ions we will be reabsorbing as well. And of course, we can't forget our infamous potassium ions, which works in counter transport with sodium ions. So the more sodium ions that you're reabsorbing, the more potassium ions you will be excreting into your urine. So that's why in the last chapter, we talked about how if you have excessive aldosterone stimulation, then that's going to give you a case of hypokalemia where you have too low of potassium because you're just excreting all those potassium out. Okay. Now, the release of this hormone, we've already talked about in the last chapter, is stimulated by the RAS pathway activation with the initial hormone release called renin. Okay, so that's why it's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system RAS pathway, because those are the hormone of action and they follow in that order of stimulation. Renin has to be activated for angiotensin to be activated, which then activates the aldosterone within the system. Okay, so renin is released when you have these three different types of situation: a decrease in your blood pressure or blood volume at the nephron, because remember, renin stimulates aldosterone, which stimulates sodium reabsorption. Sodium reabsorption also means water retention. Okay, water retention means increase in blood volume and increase in blood pressure. So that's why when you have decreasing blood pressure, blood volume, renin will be released. The second thing is if you have decreased osmotic concentration at the DCT. If you don't have enough solutes, of course, then aldosterone will be stimulated to reabsorb more sodium ions. Same thing if you have decreasing sodium ions or increasing potassium ions in renal circulation. Both will require increase in sodium reabsorption as stimulated by aldosterone, as stimulated by renin. Okay, so make sure you remember that pathway and these three situations where renin is released to stimulate aldosterone, which tells your kidneys to reabsorb more sodium ions back in. Okay, on the other hand, natriuretic peptides like AMP and BMP, which are both released by cardiac muscle cells that acts in response to abnormal stretching of heart walls. Okay, so that's why they're called AMP and BMP. AMP, atrio, natriuretic peptides has to do with atria, okay, and then your B type. Both are released by heart cells, okay? Now, what causes the stretching or abnormal stretching of your heart chambers? We already learned that's when you have either increase in blood pressure or blood volume that's going to stretch your cells, and that's going to activate receptors that's going to stimulate the release of AMP and BMP. Now, those natriuretic peptides will then stimulate increased fluid loss by your kidney, known as diuresis, okay? Antidiuretic versus diuresis, okay? So antidiuretic for ADH, and then diuresis for natriuretic peptides, okay? Because now you have too much blood volume, too high blood pressure. The easiest way to bring it back down is to excrete more fluid outside of your body. Of course, now that you need to excrete fluid, you need to reduce thirst, okay? And also block the action of ADH and aldosterone because you no longer need to reabsorb water. Okay, so in this chart, this kind of summarizes what we went over in the last chapter. Okay, remember now, if your cardiac muscle cell senses that abnormal stretching is going to be stimulated to release AMP and BMP, couple things it does. Okay, AMP and BMP, first thing it would do is induce vasodilation, which directly brings down blood pressure. Okay, it will also decrease the amount of renin that's produced, which decreases angiotensin and aldosterone, which all of those leads to less or decreased sodium ion reabsorption, which then leads to less water reabsorption, decreased blood volume, decrease that blood pressure back. The other thing that AMP and BMP do is increase GFR. Remember, I talked about this in the last chapter. The more blood volume you have, the more filtration you got to do in response to get rid of all that extra volume. Okay, so you're kind of doing three things at the same time with AMP and BMP. You are dilating your blood vessels to lower your blood pressure. You're telling your body to stop reabsorbing water because we need to bring that blood volume down. And you're telling your kidneys to filter more stuff out because you need to get rid of all this volume that's, sort of accumulating in your body. Okay, so that all of that together will ultimately bring down your blood pressure ultimately. Okay, all right. So just as I have emphasized last semester about osmosis, where water always follows salt, that's why fluid and electrolyte balance always goes hand in hand. When you lose body water, your plasma volume will decrease while electrolyte concentration increase, as illustrated here. Okay, you lose volume, but your electrolytes are still there, and hence that's why all these dots now have become more concentrated within that area of the body. When you gain or lose excess electrolytes, then you will gain or lose water due to osmosis. If you gain electrolytes, you're going to gain water. If you lose electrolytes, you're going to lose water due to the fact that water always follows salt. Okay? Salt don't follow water. Water always follows salt. Okay? So make sure you know the difference between these two. Okay. So for fluid balance, we have to have the amount of water gained must equal to the amount of water that's lost. Okay, sodium is actually a good indication of your body's water content at the moment because it is the most abundant ion in the ECF, and we just talked about how water always follows salt. Okay, so that's why salt is a good indication of your water concentration status. It's hard to measure in a patient how much water they have in their body, but their salt reading and measurement will indirectly tell you that their hydration status. So if that person has a lot of body water in them, okay, they will have low sodium concentration because all that water content will dilute out the concentration of salts. Whereas if the person's body has low amount of water, then you will detect high amount of salt or concentration in the body because that person doesn't have enough water, and all that salt ions is just concentrated inside the body. Okay. Now, the amount of water gained each day must be equivalent to about 2,500 mils per day to balance the loss. Okay, so in this diagram, it tells you that this is the average intake of water per day due to metabolism. Now, remember that through the electron transport chain, your oxygen was your final electron acceptor that's going to turn oxygen into water. So that's where that metabolism production of water come from. The food that you eat has water content as well. And then, of course, the drinks that you drink each day, beverages, have water content. Okay, yeah, now your average output of water per day would be contributed by your feces, sweat, insensible loss of through your skin and lungs, and I'll talk about what these are, and your urine. Okay, mostly your urine. So now let's go back to metabolism here. So this is what we're talking about in terms of metabolic generation of water, because remember the oxidative phosphorylation of the electrotransport chain and aerobic metabolism is what's making water at the end of that electron transport chain. Insensible perspiration is that evaporation of water via your skin if you're outside in the sun, or lungs. Okay, so me talking very loudly in this lecture also makes me feel very thirsty, even though I'm not doing intense exercise or sweating profusely, but me speaking and having air flow in and out of my airways, that's going to contribute to that insensible perspiration. Okay, now, sensible perspiration is then the evaporation via your sweat glands. Okay, this is when you go outside, have a run, or stand in the hot sun. All that evaporation from your sweat glands is sensible perspiration. Okay, all right. So water will always circulate freely within each ECF compartment, okay, and hence the exchange between plasma and interstitial fluid will always go by the net hydrostatic pressure, okay? As we have talked about back in the blood vessel chapter, when more filtration happens than reabsorption, fluid will move into the interstitial fluid within the peripheral tissue, causing edema, okay? Remember, we talked about edema when we were talking about blood vessel chapter. Again, this is due to the increase in blood pressure, okay, or abnormal water movement from the, or in the case of when you have decreased BCOP. Remember I said starvation. We talked about that in the blood vessel chapter when we went into detail below about capillary exchange. So either your high blood pressure or decrease in BCOP. The high blood pressure is going to change your capillary hydrostatic pressure, your CHP. Remember that? And then if you're in starvation mode, you're going to decrease your BCOP, both of which will affect your NFP, which then you're filtrating more into your interstitial fluid, and hence you end up with edema. Now, damage to capillary walls, such as bruising or blockage of lymphatic drainage, will also lead to edema. All those things that we have already mentioned from previous chapters is just wrapping it all up in a nutshell, kind of like how fluid and electrolytes are being balanced, and why we have cases where we have fluid moving into our tissues. Okay? All right. So, when solute concentration differs in the ECF, ICF will always act in response and always try to compensate and bring things back to homeostasis. This idea is called fluid shift, okay? We're just shifting the fluid back and forth between ECF and ICF to make sure the osmotic concentration are equilibrating between the two fluid volumes, okay? Now, this will bring us back to the idea of tonicity. When osmotic concentration of your ECF increases, which means you have a lot of solutes floating around in your ECF, it then becomes hypertonic to when compared to the ICF, okay? Hypertonic. So imagine this is the ECF, this is the ICF, okay? Kind of going back to your cell osmosis stuff, okay? But now we're just naming it not red blood cell, we're naming the inside ICF and the outside ECF, okay? So if the osmotic concentration or solute concentration increases in the ICF, that's going to become hypertonic to ICF, and hence fluid will move out of your ICF into your ECF to compensate. Now, if osmotic concentration in your ECF, okay, goes down, okay, then that you have less solute in the ECF than your ICF, then water will move into your ICF from your ECF to compensate, okay? And of course, isotonic on both ways, ECF, ICF is the happiest situation where things are in equilibrium. So, in a sense, your ICF is kind of like acting as a water reserve to balance any ECF changes due to dietary gains or loss. If ECF decreases in volume or fluid content, your ICF will always try to compensate by moving water towards ECF to balance the osmotic concentration. Okay, so here's this is a good image here to explain that. This is your ICF. This is your ECF. So if you have a decreased ECF volume, which then your fluid level goes down, this becomes hypertonic to your ICF. And remember, water always flows in the direction of hypertonic, okay? So that's why water will flow from your ICF to your ECF to balance the water content and, in a sense, your solute concentration of both ECF and ICF, okay? So now your osmotic concentration equilibrates and everybody is happy. But note that the overall fluid content for both ECF, ICF, it has now decreased because you have just shared some fluid from the ICF into the ECF. So you better go drink water still. Okay? This is only going to be temporary fix for you, but you still need to replenish your body with water so you don't have that decreased overall fluid in your body. Okay? All right, so in the case of dehydration, what happens? Okay, you are mostly losing water, of course, but retain the amount of electrolytes or solutes in your ECF, and hence the osmotic concentration of your ECF increases when you have the case of dehydration. So that's why fluid will move from your ICF into your ECF to compensate and balance the osmotic concentration differences between the two sides. But both ECF and ICF will be more concentrated than normal because their overall volume has decreased, and both volumes are now lower before your fluid loss. And that's why I said, even though you have that temporary fix from the ICF that we can rely on, in the end, you still have to go drink some more water to replenish your overall body water content. Okay? Now, if this persists for a longer period of time, you will end up with hypernatremia, okay? Abnormally high amount of sodium concentration. Remember we talked about how concentration of sodium ions is a good indication of the body's water content condition. So any situation that depletes the body of fluid, for example, excessive sweating, vomit, diarrhea, plus low water intake, okay? Not only are you excreting a lot, you're not taking enough water. This will lead to very concentrated body fluids, okay? And the lower body fluids means lower blood volume, and as a result, lower blood pressure, okay? And this lower blood pressure, if not fixed soon, can get dangerous because it can lead to shock, okay? Meaning that the body is in critical condition and it is not getting enough oxygen. That's what going into shock means, okay? So, under normal conditions, okay, when you are in dehydration mode, your hypothalamus within the brain should do something, should sense your body's cry for help and release ADH through your neurohypophysis, your pituitary gland, okay, and tell your kidneys to preserve water. Release more ADH, reabsorb more water. Less water is released in the urine as well, okay, so you pee less, smaller volume concentrated urine. Now, this is in the case when things are supposed to happen in a normal, healthy person. But there's a condition called diabetes insipidus, okay? Now, diabetes insipidus, even though it's not bold and underlined, make sure you know what this is because it can appear on the exam. Okay, I didn't put it as a bold and underlined word on this out here, but make sure you know what diabetes insipidus, because a lot of people tend to think it is related to diabetes mellitus, but it's actually two different things. Somehow, in this condition, the kidneys do not respond to ADH. And they continue to produce urine with high water content, large volumes of dilute urine. Even though your body is in a critical condition where you need to reabsorb water, if you have diabetes insipidus, you're not going to decrease the amount of water excretion, and you're not going to reabsorb water. Even though the situation is, like I said, critical, okay? When you have this condition, you're just not going to respond properly, okay? Now, make sure you know that diabetes insipidus is different, and don't confuse with diabetes mellitus. They both start with the word diabetes, but diabetes insipidus has nothing to do with blood glucose content or insulin, okay? The only thing they share is the symptoms, okay? They both share the same symptoms of constant thirst and frequent urination, but their underlying reason is different, okay? Diabetes mellitus, whether type 1, type 2, has to do with insulin and blood glucose, whereas diabetes insipidus has to do with insensitivity of ADH by your kidneys, okay? So it's as if your kidneys don't see existence of ADH, okay? Now, these are some of the signs of dehydration from mild cases to severe cases. You can read through those. Now, clinical treatment for acute dehydration would be give the person hypotonic fluids by mouth or IV to increase your ECF volume back and promote fluid shift back into your ICF. Now, it is, perfectly not harmful to the person to give them isotonic saline solution, but by giving them hypotonic saline solution, you're going to even drive that water reabsorption even faster, because this person is under acute dehydration situation. You're going to give them fluid very, very quickly and tell their cells, hey, you got to reabsorb all that water we're giving you, okay? And hence giving them hypotonic solution would really drive the fluid to go into the cells, okay? All right, so remember that our body always needs to be kept at homeostasis, and that's why when we can't handle things going too low, we also can't allow things to get too high. When we are at hyperhydration, okay, this is talking about that we are increasing in water intake, okay, and that will cause ECF to increase in volume and become hypotonic compared to ICF, opposite of what happens to dehydration. So if you remember our little drawing of ECF and ICF, here's ICF, ECF, okay? So if you increase water intake, so your new ECF water level goes up, now you have less solute and ECF has become hypotonic compared to ICF, so water will then move inwards toward your cells into your ICF to try to achieve equilibration, okay? And both ECF and ICF has now more fluid than they necessarily need, okay? Both of them will have larger volume and lower osmotic concentration. Now, that is not a good thing either. Now you have too much volume and you have dilute cases of all electrolytes that's floating around in your body. So now increased water intake does not mean drinking a liter of water while you're doing intense workout or drinking gulps of water after a meal. reemphasize that because people get confused about what is hyperhydration. Okay, it does not mean that after running on the treadmill for an hour, you drinking that gulps of water, you're going to end up with hyperhydration. Okay, you're not, because you are losing water when you're working out. Those are normal conditions where your body is telling you that you are in need of water. You feel thirsty, so go drink. Okay, hyperhydration means either drinking extremely large amount of water. We're talking about gallons of water within minutes or few hours, like a water drinking contest without going to pee, okay? And you didn't exercise, okay? Or abnormal situations, like if you're accidentally infused with hypotonic solution by a health professional that didn't know what they were doing, okay? When you're not dehydrating, if you're infused with hypotonic solution, then you're going to end up with hyperhydration. Or if you have renal failure, heart failure, endocrine disorder, where you're just excessively releasing ADH, those are the cases which will cause hyperhydration, okay? So this brings us to a very tragic case, okay? This tragic event happened in 2007, where a radio station in California hosted a water drinking contest to win a Wii console. The competition was called Hold Your Wii for a Wii, okay? So the contestants were given water within a certain amount of time, and you were not allowed to pee. What an idea. Okay, those that can't hold their Wii then loses. Okay, of course, a lot of people can't hold their Wii, but what if one person can hold their Wii voluntarily? Okay, well, this contestant, the winner, Jennifer Strange, probably has more ability to hold their Wii than other individuals. She was only 28 years old. She ended up drinking about 2 gallons of water without going to pee. Okay, so you're just having 2 gallons of extra fluid floating around in your ECF and hence going into your ICF. Okay, you can imagine what kind of crazy things going to happen to your cells. Okay. She won the contest, but was actually found dead in her home hours after due to hyperhydration. She should have been heading straight for the ER for immediate treatment after the contest, okay? Had someone at least tell her not peeing when you're drinking a huge amount of water is bad for you, okay? It's kind of upsetting when you're reading some news articles about this particular situation where those people that were hosting the radio show say, oh, your body is made up of 98% water, so drinking too much water is never going to kill you. Well, you don't know your anatomy and physiology and biology. It will kill you. Okay, so in those cases, you have to be very careful. Okay, so had she known anything, indication of something going wrong when you're not supposed to drink that much water without going to pee and go to the ER, it probably would have saved her life. Okay, then ER is going to give her the right medication, the right thing that's going to cause her body to release all that fluid she has just taken in as soon as possible. So hyperhydration can lead to hyponatremia, which is opposite of dehydration, where you have abnormally low amount of sodium content. Okay, and of course this leads to the case where I was talking about hyperhydration, or called water intoxication. Okay, when you're under water intoxication, you may act drunk, rapidly progress from confusion to hallucination, convulsions, coma, followed by death if not fixed soon enough. Clinical treatment for hyperhydration would be sort of the opposite of dehydration. You would administer diuretics to allow the person to pee as much of the fluid as possible, infuse concentrated salt solution, hypertonic solution, to promote the fluid shift from ICF to ECF again, so you can pee all of it out. Okay, you can't tell your cells to release all that water. The best way to tell all your cells collectively to release all that water from ICF is flooding your ECF with hypertonic solution, so that all that salt is going to drive water out of the ICF into your ECF, and in a sense into your kidney, out of your body in urine. Okay, all right. So, because we talked about the fact that fluid and electrolyte balance goes hand in hand, total electrolyte concentration will directly affect water balance. The fluid balance we are just talking about earlier, and that concentration of individual electrolytes can affect cell functions. For example, by now we know the importance of sodium ions and their large variety of roles this ion plays in different organ systems. So the balance of this ion is very critical. Okay, the amount of sodium ion uptake across the digestive system has to equal the amount of sodium excretion, or you can end up with hyper or hyponatremia, natremia that we just talked about. Note that a change in sodium content of ECF does not produce a change in sodium concentration due to the corresponding gain or water loss. Okay, so when you have gain sodium content in your ECF, so for example, going back to that, okay, ICF, ECF, okay. Well, all of a sudden you're flooding your ECF with lots of salt, okay? Now this becomes hypertonic compared to the ICF. This won't result in a concentration difference between sodium content between ECF and ICF. What's gonna happen and driven by osmosis is that fluid will move out of your ICF into your ECF when you intake a lot of salt to balance that high concentration of solutes, okay? So you won't change the ion content itself, how much salt you have, but you will change the concentration by movement of water between ICF and ECF. So what happens after you eat a salty meal or a big bag of high sodium chips? Why is it bad for you? Well, after a salty meal, sodium ions are pumped across your digestive system. Okay, solute concentration increase within your ECF, okay, like I illustrated there. More water enters the ECF from your digestive tract or your ICF through osmosis, which then increases the blood volume you have in your ECF. Remember, the fluid that makes up your ECF is your plasma and interstitial fluid, okay? So that is why people with high blood pressure and still eat salty food they would notice that all of a sudden there's all this edema going on in their feet and hands. You feel swollen in your hands because of all that salt content is just going to drive fluid to move into your ECF, okay? Both your blood, which then will increase your blood pressure even more, and also increase the amount of fluid going into your interstitial fluid, causing edema. So make sure you remember that ECF's fluid volume is always directly proportional to the blood volume, which then will always affect your blood pressure. So that's why if you have hypertension or chronic high blood pressure, you have to avoid the salty meals and salty foods because that's only going to make it worse, okay? So this is our classic homeostasis relationship chart, and now it applies to sodium concentration differences, okay? So if you have too high level of sodium in your ECF, osmoregulatory receptors in your hypothalamus will be stimulated because now you have more fluid moving in to your ECF. ADH secretion increases, okay? Kidney tells, because you have too much sodium content, you have to dilute that out. So that's why ADH will increase to reabsorb more water in by your kidneys and also promote thirst, okay? Now, because ECF osmolarity has increased, you have so much salts, okay? Water is going to move out of ECF like I was talking about. That will increase your ECF volume, decrease your sodium concentration, in a sense, restoring your sodium levels back down, okay? And in order to increase that ECF volume, that's why your ADH will increase, water reabsorption will increase, and promotes thirst, okay? This also explains why eating salty potato chips will make you feel very thirsty and want to drink something. Now, if you have decreasing sodium levels, like for example, if you sweat heavily, but you only drink water and not an electrolyte water. Now, I'm not talking about going for a 15-minute run. I'm talking about marathon runners where you're out there running for 8 hours, 10 hours, okay? That's sweating heavily, okay? and in large amounts, and you're going to lose electrolytes. So if you don't drink those electrolytes back, you're going to end up with too low of sodium content in your ECF, inhibit your osmotic receptors in the hypothalamus, decrease ADH, which tells your kidney to stop that water loss, thirst is suppressed, and then water loss decreases, okay, and to bring your sodium ion concentration back up, okay. So that's why this is bad news when you are already losing a lot of water through sweating, because now you are not drinking it. You don't want to drink as much. You're increasing water loss because you have all these electrolytes in your body that is not replenished. So that is why it's bad idea to drink plain water when you're out there running for hours and hours. You gotta drink electrolyte solutions, or else you're just gonna end up losing more water. Okay. All right. So water and salt goes hand in hand, like I said, and hence this relates both water content and salt concentration. So it pretty much goes through the same stuff that I was talking about. So make sure you follow through and goes through this homeostasis chart as a whole to understand what's going on when you have changes in your ECF volume or sodium content, either too much or too little, okay? And what does your body do to increase those back to normal levels? All right, so that was sodium ion concentration. So just as sodium ion concentration is important to the body, your potassium ion concentration is also critical because it is in countertransport with sodium ions, okay? There's 3 factors that affect the rate of potassium secretion, as we have already mentioned in the urinary system chapter. When there's changes in your potassium concentration in your ECF, okay, that's going to affect your secretion. If you have too much potassium, then it's going to secrete more, okay? Changes in the pH also affect potassium secretion, because when your pH decreases, hydrogen ions will be excreted rather than your potassium ions. Okay, remember this potassium ion secretion if your pH gets too acidic. Okay, so now that would affect how much potassium you're gonna secrete, because your sodium ions is going to reabsorb in countertransport with hydrogen ions, which means it's also going to affect your potassium ion. Okay, so sodium ion goes in, potassium ions goes out in secretion. Okay, now levels of aldosterone also affects potassium, because aldosterone affects sodium, which then affects potassium. If you have more sodium reabsorption, you're gonna have more potassium secretion. So hypokalemia is when you have too low of potassium. Hyperkalemia is when you have elevated levels of potassium. Okay. The last ion we'll talk about for electrolyte balance is calcium, which we all know is 99% stored in your bones and play key roles in muscular and neural activities, as we have learned in 2401 and also in this semester when we talked about blood clotting. Okay, and we have already talked about this immensely, how calcium is maintained in your body by the hormone released by your parathyroid gland, which is parathyroid hormone, and also calcitriol that's released by your kidneys to increase calcium reabsorption by your digestive tract and your kidneys. Okay, it stops your kidneys from releasing calcium into your urine. Okay, calcitonin from thyroid gland, however, does the opposite and will decrease the calcium concentration in your blood. When you have too low of calcium, it's called hypocalcemia, which can often be caused by hypoparathyroidism, vitamin D deficiency, and chronic renal failure. Make sure you understand why this is the case, because I can ask on the exam. Okay, hypercalcemia is when you have elevated level of calcium, okay, which is usually caused by hyperparathyroidism, too much parathyroid hormone, then you're reabsorbing too much calcium, or excessive use of calcium supplements or vitamin D supplements, which all has to do with, vitamin D has to do with how much calcitriol you're making, and in a sense, how much calcium you are reabsorbing. Okay? All right, so let's take a break here and we will return to talk about acid-base balance in part 2 of chapter 27.